Hello, and thanks for joining this panel discussion. In the time that we have here in this discussion, we will not be going into the merits of various voting systems, but instead, I hope to have a great conversation about those who are leading the efforts in voting reform can better work together to bringing about positive change. So to start us off, I'd like each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe Nina, why don't you start?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to have this discussion. I'm so happy to meet you all. My name is Nina Taylor. I serve as the Chief Executive Officer for the Center for Election Science. We are a national nonpartisan 501c3 focused on election research, research to practice, voter education, and advocating and lobbying in support of approval voting. I joined CES at the top of the year, and it's quite literally been a fast-moving train. My background includes executive leadership in national nonprofits here in Washington, D.C., artificial intelligence startups, and I'm a strategist by nature. So I enjoy taking large, complex issues and breaking it into smaller bites and focusing on targeted solutions. I've also worked as a fundraiser and advisor for a number of campaigns, and I'm really excited to join this chat.
Kaladin, maybe you can go next.
Yes, happy to. Thank you to Susan, yourself, Ruben for coordinating this panel, and to the Equal Vote Coalition for hosting this conference. It really does feel like we're on the brink of a major wave of reform in the US, and there are a lot of reforms being championed. So one of the most important things that we can all do is acknowledge our differences and try to communicate as much as possible just to make sure that we are working together and not against each other. And that's what we're trying to do at ProRep Coalition. And yes, my name, introduce myself. I'm Kaladin Myers. I'm the executive director of ProRep Coalition. We are a relatively new nonprofit with a mission to enable multi-party democracy in California through education and coalition building for proportional representation. I'll share a little bit more about what we're doing later on, and yeah, pass it off to Ruben or Jim.
Jim, why don't you go ahead?
Okay. I take a lot of notes, so so Jim Lindsay, I'm the co-founder of the California Ranked Choice Voting Coalition and Institute. Before that, Californians for Electoral Reform. I have worked nationally, working with other states, but mainly I'm focused on California. Just been doing it for a very long time. I think 40 years, maybe it's 30 or 35, I'm not sure. And I've been involved in California in almost all of the campaigns that we've had in California for ranked choice voting. So I mean, and I've just done a lot of campaigns outside of electoral reform too. So I serve as a kind of one of the campaign experts in CalRCV. I also do a lot of fundraising. I'm currently running a group called Ranked Choice Voting for Your City, where some miscellaneous person wants to bring ranked choice voting to their city, and we have a group that meets every week, and we help each other out. I also wrote the software that Cambridge uses to count its PRCV elections. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. And Ruben, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ruben Michael Montejano, and I'm a board of director of Equal Vote Coalition, as well as the currently elected position for Star Voting Action as their chair. I am so excited for everyone to be here. I'm excited for Equal Vote for hosting this, and I look forward to the conversations we're going to have. I'm hoping it's a very, very beautiful conversation.
Okay, I wanted to start off with hearing more from you all about how you got involved with voting reform and maybe what inspires you about the movement. Why don't we go backwards this time? Ruben, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So I first got into voting reform through old videos on YouTube about ranked choice voting. I was observant on the voting reform, but I didn't really look into it more in depth until till our governor in California decided to repeal the ranked choice voting initiative that was signed through the legislature. Not initiative, the ranked choice voting bill that was signed by the legislator. But and so after he did that, I decided to look more in depth, and I found approval voting, I found score voting, and then it led me to star voting. And after doing some more research, I felt like star voting was a great place to start, and that's why I just decided to join. And yeah.
Great, thanks. Jim?
Yeah, so I was doing various kinds of political work and was finding it to be rather difficult. This is in my 20s, I'm now in my 60s. And I thought I was like really interested in Europe. So I started looking into, I just felt like two parties it was such a constraining problem, short-term and long-term. So I was interested in having a multi-party system. And so I looked into Europe, discovered PR, did some political science reading, and Duverger's law. And so I became a huge PR fan, but didn't feel like I could really do it by myself. So I did nothing until this new group started called CPR, which was Citizens for Proportional Representation with an exclamation point, which went through a couple of name changes and what's now Fair Vote. And so when they formed, I felt like, okay, there's going to be some kind of support. And then we founded CPR for California at the time, and we went through some name changes. And that group is currently called the Californians for Electoral Reform. And then later on, I co-founded the Cal RCV. And we were just having such a hard time getting any traction at all for PR back 20, 30 years ago. I can't remember exactly which it was, that we made the very, very rough decision of, at the time, which was very controversial and some people quit for good, to focus on promoting RCV, feeling like it would solve a number of problems and like make it more viable to get PR. And then RCV performed better than I thought it would, actually. I was not very happy about it, but it just seemed like there was no better choice. And so I now feel more enthusiastic about RCV than I used to be. But really, I want PR. And that's where a lot of people are at. So yeah, that's how I got started.
Great. Kaladin?
Yeah, no, happy to go next. Like Jim, I want PR as well. Very much so. So what caused me to get into electoral reform? It's a decent question. The joke I always share is that as a boy growing up in Canada, I had two choices: be a hockey player or start an electoral reform nonprofit in California. And hockey didn't work out, so this was a natural default. No, electoral systems are very far removed from most political conversations. So the people who are attracted to this space, it is a bit peculiar because it's new and emerging and quickly growing. But what attracted me was I never went to university when I was younger. I came out to California, did the whole Hollywood artist punk thing, and worked in construction and as a handyman to get by. When 2016 came around and Trump was elected, that was the wake-up call. I basically just wanted to get an answer to the question, how the hell did this just happen and what's going on right now? So I went to community college and I transferred to a 4-year institution, and through that time learned that no matter how many ways you cut things up and put them back together, the central problem with our politics in America right now are a two-party system. It is our two-party system. And the fact that we're dealing with two fully polarized parties where representation for one group comes at the direct expense of another. And when you look around the world and you see that most advanced democracies have multiple parties and they're not experiencing the same democratic backsliding that we are in the US, it becomes clear that there's better ways to move forward. And so that's, I guess, where I find inspiration, looking at the other democracies around the world, especially ones like New Zealand, that have had major issues with their winner-take-all elections, and through the referendum process have actually been able to transition to a version of proportional representation. And that's exactly what we're trying to do in California. We're looking at where reform has been practiced before, where it's been successful. And here we're trying to champion a 2028 ballot initiative that would adopt proportional representation in California state legislature. So what inspires me about the movement in the US, the electoral reform movement now, the fact that it is growing so quickly, and it feels like this is the countercultural movement of this generation. It might be a little bit soon to say that, and I think counterculture, it's looked a lot sexier in the 70s when they had their costumes and everything. But when looking at these organizations here today, the alternative parties that are really beginning to work more cohesively with one another to champion reform, it feels like we're on the brink of something major and something special. And our democracy has a very real potential to improve because of the changes that a lot of the people here today are promoting.
I guess it's my turn. You
Yeah.
were on mute.
Yeah,
Okay.
thanks, Nina.
Yeah, no problem. So how I got started is I'm 100% an outsider. So I'm an outsider to the reform community. I'm a native of Washington, D.C., and they simply just pour politics into the water here. So my first job was a researcher for the United States Department of Agriculture. My first day on the job was 9/11. So the speed in which my day ended also indicates, I think, the speed in which I had going through my professional career. So I spent 2 decades in medical specialty societies, working across presidents and across parties. I was deeply involved in physician education and supporting needed change for patients, specifically in oncology and mental health, whether that was access to physicians in rural communities or advocating and challenging prior authorization and some changes to insurance. I just had this growing love for advocacy and the complexity in navigating Capitol Hill. And I think what changed for me was January 6th. I actually had to evacuate my home. I saw the fragility of democracy, and I knew I had a skill set as a particularly divergent, innovative, strategic thinker that could benefit the landscape as a whole. And so I shot my shot for the Center for Election Science. I was always the live wire candidate, and so now I'm able to take something that is a solid reform and start moving it in a complex system while getting people on board and sharing our shared story, and I think our shared appreciation for this change, this inflection point that we're seeing. There is this fertile ground for reform. There is this openness to engaging our legislators and educating the public. And really there is a need, right? So there's a need around election integrity, giving voters, I think, more power in their vote, the way in which campaigns are run. There's a lot of these changes that I think the work that we do would inform that. And so that's how I became involved, and I'm super happy to be here.
Great. Well, like all of you alluded to, we do find ourselves now in a time where the electorate is very interested in voting reform. And there are many folks like you all who are passionate and smart and have the ability to bring forth a better system. So how can we harness that interest and passion, and have that work towards a stronger democracy, like understanding voter, and while understanding that voting reform organizations are offering different solutions to the problem. Not everyone is favoring the same solution. Not everyone is looking at it through the same lens. But it's all towards a better outcome. So maybe can we have a discussion about that? And feel free to just chime in and work off each other, or, on having that conversation. How can we go about this so that, because we all know the ultimate goal is to just have a better system, a stronger democracy. Yeah.
Well,
Does anyone want to start? Jim, thank you.
I guess I'll give it a go.
Great.
I don't see the premise. I don't see, I don't understand it. Maybe you're right. But people are not, I do other things other than RCV and electoral reform. And unless I bring it up, it's never brought up. People are not saying, oh, we're looking to change the American voting system or whatever. So I wish it was true. We are seeing in polls are horribly expensive, but every now and again, somebody comes up with the money for something or other. And there's polls, and we're seeing, really good numbers for RCV, but they're just RCV polls. They're not really scientific, looking at multiple systems. But it may translate to other systems. Maybe it's an indicator, a broader indicator. We do know that people regularly say that there should be third parties, and not just the two parties. That's been a very long-standing feeling in the American electorate. But I wish that were true, but I just don't see it. So how do we get there? It's setting up speaking engagements and getting some earned media and stuff like that. It's just the hard work of talking to people one way or another, either directly or indirectly, and getting them to think about it. And when you do that, people respond pretty well. But they just don't think about it. It's just the way they vote. It's not, they don't think, oh, the way that I vote is actually a little screwy and has some bad consequences, and maybe we should try something different. They're not, it's irritating actually that people don't think like that.
I think that is a really good point. It isn't necessarily the voting systems that people are thinking about. People are just kind of dissatisfied, and they're kind of disgruntled with what we have right now in our system and as our system. And nobody thinks about the voting part of it. So all the more so when you have voting systems on the ballot, they've never heard of them, or they're just, so it's all of that. Like, how do you educate? How do you do it in a way that is honest and factual? Because you're going to have different systems on the same ballot. And if you've never thought about this, how can you distinguish? And they're both telling you the other one is lame, or, so how do we work in the movement to make it a positive outcome for democracy?
Yeah, I would just add that I really think it's about creating a space where the reforms can just exist in practice, right? So we're coming to this crossroads where we need to move from theory and deep discussion to implementation. And so that research and analysis can be conducted on how the voting reform is not only educated to the community, our legislators, election administrators, but time to really take a deep look at voter expression and preference, and understanding what the limitations of the reforms are, and how, not only it performs, but does it address the ills of our current system, like polarization and vote splitting. I think our community of reform advancing nonprofits should be able to select jurisdictions that they believe the reform would do well. And I think we should open pathways for that voting reform to be adopted, whether through ballot initiative or through legislative strategy, without financial and I think bad political interference. I don't think the process happens when a single reform operates as a monopoly. I think for us to come together, and I think for us to advance the reforms, it looks like, seats at the table when reviewing research from a pilot study or form a partnership. I think it's having a direct response to America's public outcry for change, right? I think that if we have identified that meaningful change happens at the ballot box, then we should come together to ensure the reforms like the ones on this panel can be implemented, performed, then analyzed, but most importantly, iterated upon.
Yeah, and those are some great points. And I just wanted to add that I think a lot of what we as we advocates have to do is meet people where they are, because a lot of people do see they're discontented by our current process, and they kind of have a feeling of what the problem already is, the polarization, like Nina mentioned, and the feeling like their vote doesn't matter, and all those other limitations that we do currently have in our current voting system. And I think meeting people where they are by bringing them, asking them, what do you think the problem is? If the problem is polarization, we are all as the solution to that problem. Yeah, and that's what I think we really need to do, as well as all the other things that Nina and Jim mentioned.
Just to piggyback off of everyone, because I think there were everybody made great points. So a big part of our collective work is science communication. It's taking the decades of political science research that has been put together and explaining it and creating a more accessible version of it and sharing it with a broader audience. Because when it comes to meeting people where they are, where people are right now is dissatisfied with a two-party system and hungry for more choices. Proportional representation is the only electoral reform, and I think that's like a specific term to use as opposed to voting method reform, because there is a difference. But PR is the only reform that reliably produces robust multi-party democracies. So that said, we know that 85% of the public believes that major political reform is needed. And we know that in California, 71% of Californians believe more parties are needed. So how do we get from A to B? If we know that our winner-take-all system generates a two-party democracy and proportional representation generates multi-party democracy, how do we get to PR? Now, this is where there's some differences, especially when it comes to the different voting methods and also advocating for electoral reform versus voting method reform. And I think, how can we work together more productively? Kind of like Nina was sharing, we need to be engaging the communities that these election reforms impact the most, which involves bottom-up advocacy and campaign building and movement building, rather than having a top-down approach of saying, oh, this is the voting method reform you need. Just sprinkle this on some of your elections and everything's going to be fine. That's not working. We haven't made much progress since 2016. Our politics are getting worse. So we do need to engage in a bit of democratic experimentation. And I guess from our perspective, we support all voting method reforms at Pro-Rep Coalition. Like, any step forward is a step in the right direction. And I think one of the questions that we need to grapple with is how to be a pro-reform without being anti-other reforms. And then also having that dialogue between organizations to make sure that we're not competing in the same districts, but generating support in an authentic grassroots way. I
completely agree with that. I think it would be a meaningful first step for us to not overpromise what the reforms can and cannot do. I think that has kind of sowed some discourse within the reform community. And then I think, to some of the chat, the way that these organizations were arranged, they absolutely built moats around the reforms, right? Instead of bridges, which will take work to undo the moat building, because you end up with RCV in an island on its own, approval on an island of its own. And there is a aspect of funding and the shortage of funding in the reform community that takes these issues and blows them up, right? And so at some point, we all have to come together to address that, from the nonprofit to our election administrators, there is wholly a lack of funding in the electoral space. And so if we have this monopoly that exists, right, so we have less funding, and then partnerships that are closed off because you got to the table first and you didn't mention anyone else, that does a disservice to the reform community as a whole. So we need to start kind of working together to walk back that moat building that has happened, and really, I think, realign that we are bringing reforms that the American people would like to know and understand. It's not part of their language yet. And I think having research and collective discussions around where some of the current slate of reforms do well and where they don't, and where there needs to be a little bit more attention to research, especially when you start talking about voter expression as well as gender, race, and class.
And I definitely agree with that. That's kind of why this conference was created, to keep that open dialogue. If each of our organizations don't have an open dialogue with each other, we will not be able to come together as a reform movement. And so one thing we got to keep in mind as leaders of our respective organizations is to keep open dialogue with each other. We do have differences between the respective reforms, but keeping that dialogue, keeping respectful dialogue will really promote the reform community as a whole, as like trying to be that one thing that's the solution to what our current issue is in politics and election process and all that jazz.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. The number one thing that has to happen yesterday is for us to be able to talk to each other. And we're going to have cases in which we don't agree with each other, but hopefully we have enough grown up in us that we can still talk to each other. Everything else can follow from there. From there, some agreements can be made. Surprise interference is not really cool. If interference is going to happen, it should not be a surprise. Sometimes it's not avoidable, but it shouldn't be a surprise. We could go on from there about things that we could do to work together better. What things are possible, which things are not. That's getting a little in the weeds, but the open communication, amen. It's kind of what I'm here, honestly.
Yeah.
I just wanted to highlight that, right? Like, so competition, good thing, but surprise interference where you're able to dump money and change an outcome, that is just not okay. It's not how we should operate as a community. Definitely want to elevate that.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. And I think us, if we did do that, we would be emulating the polarizing aspects of our current system, by polarizing our respective advocates, making it between an us versus them kind of mentality, which is something that we are trying to address. And we don't want to behave in that way if we're trying to address the solution.
Right.
Yeah, I excellently put, Ruben. I also want to just commend Ruben Montejano for all of the work that he's done to create the opportunity for these organizations to have communication with one another. Because like Ruben just said, unfortunately, over the last few decades, the electoral reform community in a big way has fallen victim to the very zero-sum binary political culture that we're trying to address. And one of the things that appeals to me most about proportional representation is that it's a reform that acknowledges there's a diversity of thought and we need to collaborate and compromise in order to make progress together. And that means that we're not always going to like what the agreed upon solution is, but we'll have a voice in deciding what that is. And we'll have, I don't know what the word that I was looking for, but again, just wanted to really share my appreciation for Ruben and Equal Vote again, and echo that thought.
Yeah, and of course, it can be hard because this is not an easy thing, because all of us are mostly volunteer. All of our organizations are mostly volunteer. We have one employee in California, and everybody else is a volunteer. And so you can't control necessarily what a volunteer chooses to do. And sometimes they do things that leadership doesn't want them to do, but it's a free country, and so it can be tricky. Or if you try to talk them out of it, then they get mad at you for even that. It's like, so it's easier said than done, the non-interference thing, but it's at least something we should have, or warning before interfering. There's a heads up, this happened, so we think we need to take action, and let's talk about, let's at least talk about it. But we do need to understand that we don't have control over, volunteer Joe Smith in, New Orleans or something. It's just like, sometimes they're just gonna do what they're gonna do. So that's just a reality that we kind of have to work in it somehow.
Yeah, this is great. This is the conversation that we wanted to happen, and really get this sense that people in their respective organizations want to work together, because everyone understands that the goals are similar. Everyone just has like a different way of getting there. And fairness and honesty and just respect would go a long way between all the organizations, so that everyone can kind of do what they need to do in the best way possible. I'm wondering, do any of you have maybe, I don't know if we're getting to that time, like closing statements about that? And I'm also thinking at the end, after this whole symposium, it would be wonderful to really make it a point to get organizations together, and maybe even I might suggest to meet somewhat regularly, or have some kind of regular communication, so everyone kind of stays on a similar plane and playing field, and that's a respectful one. But yeah, closing statements from you all.
Yeah, I do think that the reform community can, get together, even if it's around the research or building out a fellowship. There is this area of professionalizing our space that absolutely needs to happen, right? So we've got people that come in as volunteers. There are jobs in this space. We want a place for them to be able to land and kind of continue that work. I think that one of the big things is not only having transparent research, but being very vocal about where the reform fails, right? And where you do well at. So you can't scream from the mountaintops, that my reform is here, here, and here, when you have issues when it comes to auditing and tallying, when legislators are really upset around a reform. And if you get to the table first and then you don't say that there are other reforms to look at, when we show up as the Center for Election Science, I'm having to walk back those discussions that we aren't all RCV, right? Or we aren't all status quo, that there are other reforms that exist. And so I think some transparency around that, but also a refocus on public education. I think we, and it's very also in this chat, we can, discuss the theory very deeply and how these reforms work and don't work. Until they are implemented in practice, we don't know 100%, right? And so being able to support each other, I do think there needs to be a strong focus on investment inside of election reform in general, not just sending money to candidates, but to these nonprofits, to these volunteer organizations, so that they can buy clipboards, so that they can, have conversations with lobbyists to be able to really further move. Because you can have a ballot initiative, but without legislative support, it will die on the vine. And so I encourage folks to not only continue to iterate, but think about jumping the next curve. Like, how do we take what we've discussed and put it out into the wild, and then what, right? And so, and I think reconnecting with academia and building a network where we're sharing information. I can commit for the Center for Election Science that we will, continue to share our research. We've done a complete rebrand over the summer. And so we have a research hub where people can send us their papers, suggest proposals for us to collaborate on. And we want that exchange. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of lead that for this next generation of election reform nonprofits.
Awesome.
This has been awesome.
Awesome.
Nina, I just love that, especially what you were saying about public education and communication, because I think being transparent and honest about what we know and don't know when it comes to electoral reform and the impacts that they're going to have is crucial. Because to a few of the points that have been made, there is a lot of miscommunication, miseducation. And for example, occasionally when we provide presentations explaining what proportional representation is, people often go, oh, so that's ranked choice voting. It's like, no. And I understand the arguments in favor of ranked choice voting, as I do approval and star voting, but these are different things. So public education is incredibly important moving forward. But also, I think there's a philosophical approach to electoral reform that we need to work on cultivating a little bit more. And that's having a more process-oriented approach to reform rather than product. So rather than saying, here's ranked, sorry to pick on RCV, just the example that's coming to mind because it's one everyone knows, rather than saying, look, take this. This is the solution. This is what you need. A bottom-up process-based approach acknowledges that we might not know what our communities actually want, or we need to have that conversation of what a better political culture looks like. So we need to be able to say, at least for us, advocating for proportional representation in California, there's a variety of forms of PR. We're not selecting the one that we think is going to work best and be the ones that say, hey, yeah, this state of 40 million people, you guys need this. Rather, we're creating a democratic process that allows us to decide together which democracy reform is going to work best for our communities. And I think so combining more transparency and more authentic intellectual honesty into our advocacy conversations, and then also having them be bottom up and process oriented, will be incredibly helpful as we do begin to experiment more. So then we can learn which reforms are really going to produce politics that more people can get behind.
Thanks. Jim, do you have anything to add?
Closing statement. Sounds like a courtroom or something, but I know that's not. What I was really interested in is just that first step. Let's just talk to each other more. And so much, I'm trained as a mediator. I was a teacher. I've been on lots and lots of commissions and on a school board and stuff like that. And if you ain't talking to each other, nothing else going to happen. And it usually works best when it's one-on-one. So if you put all, okay, well, there's approval, star, PR, which is not a system, it's a family of systems, but it's more of a concept. But approval, star, RCV, There's also Condorcet. There's the balanced ballot. There's Borda. And people are doing new ones all the time. So if we were to say, oh, let's just have a group where all these various reforms can get together, you're going to have 7 people there just to start with, or so, of what I'll call the major ones, the major alternatives, plus 35 other people who have invented new systems that they think is better than all the rest. And believe me, I know this because it's me who talks to them, right? Because they always come to CalRCV, you should adopt this thing. And then I'm the person that reviews the system and talks with them like that. And so, and oh my God, sometimes they're really good systems that just have no freaking chance in the world of ever being adopted, right? And we've already got a whole bunch of good ideas out there. We don't need new ones. We need to implement some of the ones that are already there. So it's like, but you know, so it's more like, to me, more like one-on-one seems more realistic to me, where it's 2 human beings that can talk to each other. And if there's something else that, you know, is everybody coming together, you know, once a month, maybe that works. I mean, Caledon's kind of doing that, right? Or trying to do it. And or once every 3 months. I'm not sure what the rate is, but that's a tough one. So it all starts from us talking to each other more. That's what I'm really hoping. And when there's a misunderstanding, there's a lot of lack of trust, I have to say, in the RCV movement of other organizations. A lot of hard feelings, and I think it goes the other way too. And so, but you just got to talk to each other to work that stuff out.
Ruben, can we give you a chance before we have to?
Yeah, I'll just be really quick that I agree with all those points, that we should all keep communicating with each other as respective leaders in our organizations, and that we aren't going to get things to, we aren't going to get the reforms we want and the US desperately needs without talking to each other, keeping an open dialogue, trying to educate voters on what things, what these systems do, the trade-offs of each voting system and electoral reform system. And yeah, I think we're at their end, so I'm just going to end it there.
Thanks. Do you want to take over, Annie? Or Annie? So I'll just add that because we have the initiative process in Oregon, and I was one of the canvassers for Star Voting, I totally agree with that talking to people part. I felt like that was the biggest part of the democracy, is that we're going around talking to people about electoral reform. That is not something that they're ever really thinking about. And like you said, everyone knows RCV. So when you go up to them with something else, it's your opportunity to talk about it all and why even you're doing it. And that one-on-one connection really brings politics and elections personal, and you know, you have a great interaction. And I think it's just the other part of democracy is, like you said, talking to each other. So anyway, Annie.
Thank you, everybody, so much. I think this was a really great conversation. And it officially marks the end of this symposium. So thank you to all the panelists here, all the moderators, and of course, everybody who's in attendance and has been at this symposium all day. I really appreciate everybody coming together for this. And I'm, excited. We're going to try to download the chat. I don't know if it's going to work or not. I clicked the button, so hopefully it'll come out and we'll share that. And so for now, we're going to go into breakout rooms, and we're going to just kind of keep them open for a while, because I think people were having good conversations in the breakout rooms. So we don't, you don't have to leave right at 4 o'clock Pacific time. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and open those up and stay as long as you like, or until I need to close my computer.